I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. We don't often weigh into national and international politics. I bite my tongue pretty often. But this last month has been extraordinary in American political history. A 10th, not quite 11th hour switch in presidential candidates, orchestrated by a political party. Political parties, we should not forget, received an untimely epitaph by no less than George Washington. But while the Democratic Party was able to come together to replace a candidate who seemed unsuitable, the Republican Party has not been able to remove Donald Trump, despite many senior Republican leaders saying that Trump was an existential threat, not only to their party, but to the country itself. But we should not forget, the Republican Party has now for 3 decades, going back to Newt Gingrich's contract with America, pursued ideological coherence with the goal of political ascendancy. So this month of August 2024 has been really out of the ordinary. To try to understand political parties and their role in American politics in this moment, I asked my UMBC colleague, party and presidential elections scholar Tom Schaller to join us. You may know some of his books. White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy came out earlier this year. And The Stronghold, How Republicans Captured Congress but Surrendered the White House. And Whistling Past Dixie, How Democrats Can Win Without the South. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving, precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Alexandria, Virginia, art rock band Jackie and the Treehorns. Stephen Rubin and Pam Long on vocals, guitars, and piano. Frank Caputo on the bass and synth. And Brian Gibson on the drums.
What would the world come to?
Tom Schaller, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Great to be here, Sunil.
You were one of the first people I know to ask Biden to step down after the first debate. How extraordinary was what happened after that?
It was a remarkable moment in American politics. And I think what was most remarkable about it is that Harris, I wouldn't say she's batting 1,000, but she has been flawless, not just since the switch, but since the debate. Like, her comms team could have brought the knives out. They could have leaked a lot of stuff. It could have looked like she was calling for him to leave. Now, sure, maybe there were some conversations that even staff don't know about between Harris and, say, people like Nancy Pelosi to make the Biden resignation and removal happen. I don't know that didn't happen. Neither do you. But I find it highly unlikely that if Harris had shown a lack of loyalty, we would have gotten whiffs and whispers of that. And we didn't. And so there was an incredible message discipline. There was an incredible amount of patience. And yet at the same time, one gets the sense that the very inner Harris team, and it might only be a handful of people, was at least making a to-do list of what they had to do if and when Biden did drop out, because she reportedly made 100 calls to various Democratic donors, state party chairs, maybe county and local leaders, a variety of people, media, to build consensus around her candidacy on the very Sunday that Biden sent that tweet out. When people say, oh, this is an unprecedented coalescing of the party, that is simply not true. And anybody who knows Joe Biden's career knows that. Bernie Sanders won and tied the first two events in 2020, Iowa and New Hampshire. Buttigieg, there's some dispute about who actually won in New Hampshire. And then Biden lost Nevada too. So through three events, Biden was 0 for 3, and no Democratic nominee had ever lost Iowa and New Hampshire, no less Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. And guess what? He turns around, thanks to Jim Clyburn, wins South Carolina. And what happened? Klobuchar, Warren, all these people dropped out and coalesced around Biden. And within 2 weeks, he basically ran Bernie Sanders out of the primary.
This last-minute switch, how far in history do you have to go back to see something like this done?
Prior to the modern primary and caucus system, it was a lot of backroom dealings, right? And so candidates were often picked at the convention. So in this case, this is earlier than that, right? Because Harris's convention, because the Democrats are the incumbent party and they go second, it was 3 weeks between the time Biden dropped out, maybe 4 weeks, and then she officially got, by virtual vote, a sufficient majority of Democratic delegates to vote for her. So in a historical standpoint, she's not the latest person to attain the nomination, because for much of the 19th century and into the 20th century, we had these contested conventions at the conventions to pick the nominees and their running mates. Now, in the modern period, that is true. I think maybe you have to go back to 68, but certainly a century, we haven't had a situation like this. So when we say it's unprecedented, I just think you have to put brackets around, what period you're talking about.
Now, in contrast, the Republican Party has not been able to remove Donald Trump, despite many of its leaders saying that Trump represents an existential threat to the party and to the country. How do you see this difference between the Democrats and the Republicans?
Tim Alberta has argued, I think very persuasively, that when the Republicans were measuring the drapes at their convention in Milwaukee, and they were, right, because they had the Biden stumble in the debate, and then they had the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. And as Alberta argued, I think quite powerfully, the Trump theory of the case from Chris LaCivita and his essentially brain trust was that our message is, with these two octogenarian or near octogenarian candidates, I'm strong and Biden is weak. And you couldn't script, if you wanted to, two more powerful events back to back than Biden's sort of at sea performance in the debate, followed whatever it was 2 weeks later by the Trump assassination attempt and the raised fist and the bloody ear and all that stuff. So it's understandable that they came out of that convention thinking, not just are we going to win, but how much are we going to win by? And the swapping out of Biden for Harris, making Trump the old, cognitively declined, senile, cranky uncle candidate, just reversed their entire narrative, which is why they don't know what to do now. I mean, Trump has openly said, this is fraud, and how can they switch it out? And we spent $100 million on Biden. We should be able to get a refund for our money. He's been nothing but a nonstop crybaby ever since. And he, at one point he openly said, he mused, and it was only like a week or 10 days ago at a campaign event. He's like, why did I agree to debate that guy? And that's an interesting question, because as you know, Sunil, historically, when did the presidential debates happen? There's usually 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate, and they usually never start until after Labor Day. And so there's conspiracy floating around that the Biden people actually wanted the June debate so that the country could see it and they could force him out. I don't think that's true. But whatever the reasoning for the Biden campaign to have this June debate, they claim that they wanted to frame the election as a referendum on Trump and make him sort of the incumbent, which Harris has turned out to do even better than Biden ever wanted to. But if that debate that we saw the third week of June had been in 2 weeks here on September 10th, and Biden strolled out and performed the way he did the third week of June, the election would have been over.
Do you still think, though, that there is something structurally different about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? Because the Democratic Party saw a problem and moved to fix it. That is, they behaved like a party. But on the Republican side, there doesn't seem to be this ability to do so. The literature, as you well know, says that candidates shape parties.
Right.
And so I'm wondering whether you see that there is a difference in the way that the Democrats work and the Republicans work party-wise.
I guess you're sort of referring to the David Carroll Hans Noel Party Decides thesis, which says that the party elites really run things. And of course, that book came out just before Trump ran the table and beat 17 basically lifelong Republicans to capture or steal away a nomination. So their book didn't look too great in 2016. But in defense of David, who I know well, and Hans to a lesser degree, they've been right prior to that, and they've been right since then. I mean, the party clearly, as I mentioned before, the party clearly rallied around Biden 4 years ago, much as the way that they did around Kerry in 2004 in the face of, oh my God, we're going to look at a second Bush term, or oh my God, we're going to be facing a second Trump term. And the party was like, let's just get this thing over with. Let's pick, this is the best candidate. Okay, we're all on the same page. Everybody vote for John Kerry. Everybody vote for Joe Biden. And basically that primary for Kerry and Biden was over within 3 weeks. And it's really party elites that decide that. And I think we saw a version of that. I mean, I'm putting an asterisk up here. A variant of that is what just happened in the last month. Notice that Harris made those 100 calls, and within 48 hours, I believe every single state Democratic Party chair endorsed her. And entire states, slates of delegates to the convention, I believe North Carolina and Tennessee went first and second in some order, announced that their entire delegates, not just their state party chair or chairman or chairwomen, but the entire delegates who had been committed and elected to nominate Biden immediately said, I support Harris. And so to me, in a weird way, the party decides thesis has been, not just ratified, but cemented by what we saw. Rank and file Democratic voters in primary and caucuses technically didn't have any say since Biden dropped out, right? They didn't rerun those primaries. They didn't have this kind of 4-week thing that some people like Ezra Klein were calling for. Everybody just switched their votes to the vice president. End of story. That's the party, meaning the party elites deciding. To me, this is the greatest confirmation of the party decides thesis.
Yeah, but only on one side.
Well, this is an open question now. Is it Trump's party? Like, I think in 2016, you're absolutely right. By 2020, and certainly by now, remember, after Trump lost in 2020, the party asked him to wait until the midterms before he declared. But I think he declared his presidential candidacy, literally by December 1st, 2022? He basically said, I dare you to run against me. That is a guy who's saying, I'm announcing 2 years before the election, I dare you to run against me, any of you. And who ran against him? Basically nobody in 2020, right? So it is his party now, and those are his delegates, and those are his rank and file voters in the primaries and caucuses. And so the party does decide now that it is Trump's party. It wasn't true in 2016. You are absolutely right about that, and Carol and Noel and their co-authors are wrong there. But it's now Donald Trump's party.
What is the role of political parties, and how has that evolved such that one party today is where party elites can make this change, and on the other side, they cannot?
The notion that, there's a whole mass of Republicans out there who want to get rid of Trump because they see him as electoral liability. I don't think that's true anymore. I think they do think he's their best chance to win. And so I guess I disagree with the premise. In 2016, I think it was true. And everybody kept waiting for the party elites. And, it was like late 2015, and they're like, eventually Trump's going to fizzle. A candidate's going to emerge. The anti-Trump's going to emerge. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But by January 1st, 2016, Trump had cleared a bunch of those George Patakis out of the field. And though he wasn't at majority support, he never was at majority support in 2016. He was at plurality support. And maybe it was only 22, 23, the sort of rump, what was soon to be called MAGA base. But he was leading that field by winter, 2015, 2016, and he never gave up that lead again.
The one thing that I was thinking about is the sense of palpable relief among Democrats and independents when Kamala Harris finally stepped in. It seemed like the outpouring of money, over $500 million, hundreds of thousands of new volunteers. There seems to be just this pent-up relief coming to the front for Harris.
You're absolutely right about that. I mean, I think when Biden was still in the race, and even before the debate, people were getting itchy. They were holding their nose. They were going to hold their nose and vote for Biden, even though he didn't look like he was very strong. It didn't look like he was all there. And what we realized is they weren't just about to hold their noses, that they were holding their breath. And they were holding their breath. And once Biden stumbled, the anticipation of swapping him out and using that extraordinary moment as an opportunity to replace him with Harris, everybody released their breath. I mean, you could feel there was a palpable sense before it got to the joy and the excitement and the positive and the affirmative feelings for the Harris and now Harris Walz ticket. There was just a sense of relief. It's going to be one of those moments. I don't want to put it on par with the shuttle Challenger or 9/11, morbid moments where people died. But I'm going to remember where I was. I was driving north from South Carolina, visiting my retired parents in Myrtle Beach, when all of a sudden, like, why is my phone buzzing? And then I was listening to a podcast, and I switched over to Sirius XM radio, and I was just listening nonstop on the radio back to DC.
If they hadn't waited for the 4 weeks, if they had done it immediately after that first debate, it would have been different. But the 4 weeks when people held their breath, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? There was incredible suspense. And then finally, release.
She benefits in a variety of ways by inheriting the nomination so late. And Republicans complain that, well, she hasn't really debated and she hasn't been tested and they haven't kicked the tires. And I think what they're frustrated by is, like, a party likes to have 8 or 10 months to build a frame around its opponents and to do the deep investigations and the Oppo research and all that other stuff and to build a narrative. We know that Obama in 2012 started taking ads out in the spring because he wanted to frame Mitt Romney as this richy rich, millionaire, multimillionaire who used venture capital to drive businesses out of companies out of business and put employees on unemployment. And by the time the Republicans had settled their primary contest, because Obama's the incumbent, and went to their convention that year, the frame had already been created. Donald Trump, of course, was doing the same thing with Biden on weakness and all this other stuff. And some of it was just general weakness. Some of it was weakness on the border or weakness on the economy, Biden inflation stuff. So they did the same thing, right? They were building a narrative on Biden because Trump effectively knew he was the nominee for 18 months before the spring of this year, because as we pointed out, he announced in basically right after the midterms in 2022. And all of that effort, all of that framing, all of that rhetoric, all of those TV appearances, all of those digital ads and TV ads and radio ads and press releases disappeared. Poof. Like the Kevin Spacey character in The Usual Suspects, poof, just disappeared into the ether. And you could sense the frustration on Trump's face and in his language at these campaign events immediately after, that they had spent all that time against a candidate they knew they could beat and all that money, and it just went down the toilet literally in 24 hours.
What do you make of this fight between Biden and Pelosi? It's not out in the open. It's kind of shaded. But what are they fighting about?
I don't think it's a personal thing as much as it is. Nancy Pelosi is a mob boss. I mean, she is tough as nails.
What did she want that she didn't get?
I don't know that there's anything that she wanted that she didn't get. She just didn't want to lose the presidency and a couple Supreme Court seats. And I don't know what was going on behind the scenes. But my best guess of it is that Pelosi and maybe Schumer to a certain degree and other Democratic leaders, I don't know how much the Obamas were involved, but that it was decided that Pelosi would privately build a coalition, even though there were members of Congress saying, we stand behind Biden, blah, blah, blah. That privately she was building a list and she was going to deliver a Goldwater moment, much like Goldwater did to Nixon in August of 74. If you remember, Goldwater went over to the White House and Kissinger and whoever else was there, Alexander Haig, and sat down with Nixon. Maybe, I think it was actually in private. And he basically said, you've lost the Senate Republicans. So you have a choice. You can do this the easy way, or you can do it after we come out publicly and it looks like we forced your hand. And either way, you're going to lose the Senate vote. So you can either get impeached or you can resign. And, if I have to come out with these names, I will. And Nixon understood that the writing was on the wall. And I suspect, I don't have evidence of this, I suspect that Pelosi and her people did the same thing to Biden and his people and said to Donilon and those guys, like, look, you can look magnanimous and you can go out and you can have a great valedictory moment and a speech at the convention and look like a guy who saved America from Trump in 2020 and then put party and country over self. Or we can force your hand, in which case the result is going to be the same. And you're going to look like a reluctant, foot dragging monster. And given that choice, I think Biden made the right decision for himself, but he also made the right decision for the party and the country.
The other part of this coalescence is really how the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris in particular were able to sideline the Gaza ceasefire faction within the Democratic Party. I mean, for the last year, young Democrats have been heckling senior Democratic leaders, including Jamie Raskin here at the University of Maryland. Biden didn't seem to be able to gather up these young folks and, channel their energy. But it seems Kamala Harris was able to do that in a way that is incredible.
Yeah, she's managed it pretty well. And I think she created some space immediately between herself and Biden after Biden dropped out. She was very chilly to Netanyahu, for example. She met with him, but you could see how cold in her body language and so forth. She's talked about the two-state solution and getting the hostages back. So she's navigated this very, very delicate sort of line that one has to dance between, expressing support for Israel as a democracy and that longtime alliance, but also, pushing back on a very unpopular Netanyahu, who's unpopular here in the States, including among Jewish Americans, and is very unpopular at his own home as well. Let's be very clear about that. And so I think the safe solution is always to criticize Netanyahu and his sort of bloodthirsty, UN busting, human rights violating policies, because he's really capitalized on October 7th, which is not to say she's out of the woods on this. This was obviously most critical in a state like Michigan that has a significant Muslim population. You could see that, of the three key swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, of the five that Biden flipped back, Michigan, I believe, was the most comfortable victory among the five. And I think he won Michigan by a wider margin, then Pennsylvania by a wider margin, then Wisconsin, and then it was Arizona and Georgia, fourth and fifth in some order. So you would expect that going into the election that Michigan would be the most comfortable state, but it looked like Biden was really losing a lot of ground there. And I think it was clearly because of October 7th. Having said that, we're 5 weeks away from October 7th and the anniversary. And so that's going to be a tricky moment, because that story is going to be front and center again here, 4 weeks out from the election on the 1-year anniversary. And Harris is going to be expected to speak to that. And so she's not out of the woods yet, but I think she's handled a little bit better than Biden, I think.
That's interesting. I kind of thought the reverse, that, no matter what, any Democrat was going to be better on Palestine than Trump. So where can they go?
I think that's a strong argument, and one that, among other arguments, Biden was failing to make. Right? Biden was failing to make the argument, you're exactly right about this, that you may not like our connection to the state of Israel. You may hate AIPAC. You may think this is, a human rights violation. This is a genocide. But Trump is worse. I don't remember really hearing that argument from Biden. To me, the failures of Biden, even before he dropped out, were pretty profound. Like, remember, the entire country now is talking about Project 2025. And is that because the presidential candidate, as of June 20th, 2024, Joe Biden and his team were making that a front and center issue? No. The person who put Project 2025 on the national consciousness and turned it into a national meme overnight was Taraji Henson, who isn't even an elected official, right? She announced it on the Emmys or the Grammys or whatever it was, that award show, and suddenly the whole country was talking about something in a way that is the responsibility of a presidential campaign. And I mention that to echo your point, which is saying Trump, because if you read what he says and what he promises and how he supports Netanyahu, as bad as you might think the Biden administration is, your alternative is still worse, right? And so if you want to make a protest vote by voting against Biden in the primary, fine. But if you're going to stay home or vote for Trump and you're pro-Gaza, you're making a fatal mistake because he's clearly going to be worse. He doesn't care one bit about Gazans, right? But Biden wasn't articulating that argument in a way that I heard. He was defending his own policy, but he wasn't defending it as it could be worse. I think Harris has been very shrewd on this count, and much in the way that I think Biden had failed in terms of message on things like Project 2025. And so the fact that a presidential candidate, no less a presidential incumbent, hadn't been able to move Project 2025, his use of the bully pulpit in the media, to make that a national issue, hadn't been able to make the Trump as an alternative on the Israel-Gaza question a national meme, testifies to the fact that whatever his level of cognitive ability or cognitive decline, the Biden campaign was asleep. And Harris is wide awake, woke, you might say.
I'm sure they'd like to hear that. We can't end this without talking about the impact of the presidential race on Maryland, and particularly the U.S. Senate race. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I saw the polls this week. I mean, it makes sense to me. What, 46-46 or 47-47? I mean, we have a dead heat race. To the extent that also Brooks can make it a nationalized race, she'll win. Hogan wants to make it a state race. He wants people thinking about him and his governorship and his personal likability, which he's very likable and was very popular as governor. And if he makes it a referendum on his 8 years in Annapolis, he will win. What effect does Harris have in terms of coattails down ballot? For a lot of people, particularly young people and people of color and or women, or some combination of those three things, the symbolic power of registering and voting, or if you're already registered, maybe voting for the first time in a presidential election, is pretty potent. And even though it's not going to save Maryland for Harris, she's going to win walking away, you might want to say, I cast my first presidential vote for Kamala Harris, and along the way, I checked the box of the other African-American woman, one slot below her on the ticket, right, on the ballot, which is also Brooks. And so also Brooks, I think, benefits from the switch. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Democrats were despondent. We know that there was a 31% difference in the enthusiasm gap between Democrats and Republicans, like in the poll a week before Biden dropped out. And that gap has basically disappeared. There's a lot of evidence, of course, that, who controls the governorship and all this other stuff doesn't affect electoral votes, and who's winning the national presidential race doesn't necessarily affect the down ballot Senate races. But, I think in this particular case, this weird case of a deep blue state with a popular former moderate pink Republican governor, Hogan would be, I think, maybe not coasting, but I think he'd be in the lead position heading into the far turn here if it was Biden still at the top of the ticket.
The Hogan people are now making an argument for split ticket voting. So even if you vote for Harris, vote for Hogan for U.S. Senate, because then he will provide a check on the Democratic president.
I never understand this argument. People who say they revere the Constitution want to add this partisan check on top of the existing checks and balances as if divided government is better. Now, look, there is some evidence in terms of budgeting and so forth on both the state level and on the national level that divided government does perform sometimes better than unified governments. But my view, and what I always tell my students, is like, at least when you have unified government, you know who did it, right? You know who to blame or to credit with the managing of the government. And so when one party controls the government, all three branches, whether it's governor, state Senate, and state house, or whether it's president, U.S. Senate, and Congress, at least you know who did it. But of course, since 1968, we've had divided government about 72% of the time. And would anybody describe our politics since 1968 as functional? Not fiscally or whatever. So when people are like, let's have divided government, I'm always like, are you crazy? By the way, on a related note here, and not this particular race, because in this race, it's inverted. Also, Brooks is running behind Harris in Maryland, and of course, will finish behind. And that's really a Hogan effect. But if you look at the recent polls that just came out, I mean, for weeks now, but the new polls that just came out this week, the Fox News polls, almost every Democrat in these key competitive Senate races is running way ahead of Harris, right? Like Gallego is now, like in the latest Fox poll, up by 15 over Kerry Lake, and Sherrod Brown is ahead, and Casey's ahead. And I'm not just saying they're ahead, but they're ahead of the margin that Harris is over Trump, which means there is a significant number of voters, 3, 4, maybe in Arizona, 10%, who are telling pollsters, I'm going to vote for Trump, but I'm going to vote for insert Democratic Senate candidate's name here. I find that fascinating. Like, who are these Trump Gallego voters? Who are these Trump Sherrod Brown, I can see that because he's kind of got that working class guy thing. Who are these Trump Casey voters, right? Who are these people? I literally want to know who they are, because Trump is running way ahead of his Republican Senate nominees in most of these races.
Tom Schaller, please come back when you find out.
All right, let's do something after the election soon.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, I'll see you soon, my brother.
That's UMBC political science professor Thomas Schaller, author of many books, but most recently, White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analyses. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producer, Adama Gay, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Alexandria, Virginia alt-rock band, Jackie and the Treehorns, Steve Rubin and Pam Long on vocals, guitars, and piano, Frank Caputo on bass and synth, and Brian Gibson on drums. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihbpod.org. I hope you will subscribe, share, and rate the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Give it some time and I'll be front page news. I tell you what, I've got nothing more to lose. I might be too much for you to explain. My own persistence as immortal remains.